This story is about where the money will come from. 1.3 trillion may seem like a very large amount of money, but let's put it in perspective. Our estimates show that the global GDP will be around $150 trillion in 2035. So 1.3 trillion will be less than 1% of global GDP. A more relevant comparison is how much we invest in infrastructure. The world invests approximately 10 to 15% of GDP on infrastructure every year. $1.3 trillion will be 1/10 of that in 2035. Now, let's go to Nairobi, where Melanie Robinson, WRI's Global Director of our Climate, Economics and Finance program, is joining us to help us understand how we can get to the $1.3 trillion. So Melanie, let's start from basics. What was in the $300 billion goal that countries agreed to in Baku last November?
Well, to understand the 300 billion, we need to go back to the previous goal of 100 billion, and 116 billion was finally delivered in 2022. That was made up of three parts. First, there was the bilateral part, so rich country governments giving to poorer countries, the multilateral part, multilateral development banks, multilateral climate funds, and thirdly, leveraged private finance. Now, the 300 billion has got the same three parts, but expanded, especially the MDB bit, and it does count money going from a broader set of countries.
Melanie, thanks. We just heard from Courtney and Katie that there are diverse needs for different kinds of investments. Will this $300 billion goal be able to meet that demand?
Well, we don't know exactly what mix of grants and loans and private finance is in that 300 billion goal, but there will certainly be a good amount which is in long-term loans and private finance, which is so important for funding investments that have a return, like renewables, especially in those richer developing countries. But it is so important that in this 300 billion, we have enough of that precious grant and highly concessional, cheap loan finance, because that's really important for adaptation, loss and damage, just transition funding, to the poorest and most vulnerable countries in particular. And that's why it's so important that actually just before the agreement to 300 billion, we found out that the fund that the World Bank has for the poorest and most vulnerable countries was replenished so that they have got 100 billion to spend over the next 3 years.
And do you think that debt burden, which is already a significant problem for over 50 countries, will become an even bigger issue?
Yeah, MDBs are a really amazing leveraging machine. For every $1 of taxpayers' money that goes in there, they can turn that into $4, even up to $10 in money provided to developing countries. And what they've managed to do over the last few years through some reforms is stretch that money even further. So a lot of the MDB growth has come from those reforms, from that stretching of the money that they already have. Now, debt is an issue, and an increasing number of developing countries are in debt distress, and that makes it particularly important that there's enough concessional finance, that loans are long-term and affordable, and ultimately that we find a more effective way to restructure and even relieve debt.
I think restructuring debt needs to again take center stage, but it hasn't been a big part of the conversation for a while. Let's assume for a minute that we will be able to get to $300 billion. That still doesn't even get us near what we need. Experts think that half of the $1.3 trillion needs to be public finance. What are the other ways we can increase public capital?
So there are three big ways that we can do it. The first is capital increases, the multilateral development banks, putting more money into the banks so they can really leverage that and provide more to developing countries. Second is innovative taxes. We can tax some of the polluting areas that are under tax at the moment, like aviation, maritime, oil, and that could raise over 200 billion. And thirdly, we will need to look for other innovative sources because even that won't be enough.
Thank you, Melanie, for laying out how we can start building towards a $1.3 trillion goal. Let's look at what to watch for in 2025. First, will member countries consider more fundings to MDBs so they can increase their capacity to finance? Current political headwinds may make it difficult. But let's remember that the last capital increase was in 2018, when some of those same headwinds were also at play. Second, will international taxes gain traction as new sources of climate finance? For example, Will the International Maritime Organization make progress on establishing levies on shipping? Countries including Kenya, Barbados, France, and Brazil have put together a task force to look at new ways to raise additional finance through international taxes or levies. Will there be broad acceptance of their proposal when they release it at COP30 in Berlin? Third, the Finance for Development Conference will take place in Seville in June. This is a gathering of world leaders that takes place every 4 years to discuss the future of development finance. Will they make strides in reforming the global financial architecture? Will they bring climate, nature, and development finance together in a more coherent way? Fourth, just in the past week, the US has frozen almost all foreign assistance, including all climate finance. While there will be review over the next 90 days, we'll be watching to see how much of this finance is ultimately cut. A US retreat on development finance would have serious consequences. For the US, it could damage key geopolitical relationships, leave the country behind in important markets, and risk knock-on impacts on security and migration. For the world, this has widespread ramification for people who rely on life-saving assistance from the US. It is still too early to tell what US cuts will mean for reaching the $300 billion and $1.3 trillion goals by 2035, but they may impact the pace of the scale-up. We must explore multiple avenues to ensure climate finance reaches $1.3 trillion by 2035. This means recognizing that climate finance is not a niche concern, but an integral part of the broader international development context and goals. In the best case scenario, public finance will only get us almost halfway to $1.3 trillion. So how do we get the remaining $700 billion? Experts suggest this will need to be filled with international private capital, which brings us to our next story.